Trump was rushed off stage by the Secret Service after a shocking incident only moments after he began speaking at a Saturday rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Details about what happened are still unclear, but loud bangs were heard inside the venue, possibly shots fired, as Trump was making his last public remarks ahead of next week's Republican convention in Milwaukee. His ear appeared to be bleeding. The Secret Service issued this statement saying, quote, "An incident occurred the evening of July 13th at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania. The Secret Service has implemented protective measures and the former president is safe. This is now an active Secret Service investigation and further information will be released when available." The Trump campaign also released a statement that says President Trump thanks law enforcement and first responders for their quick action during this heinous act. He is fine and is being checked out at a local medical facility. More details will follow. A large number of Secret Service agents is in Milwaukee right now ahead of the convention. They're trying to piece together what happened here in Butler. The former president, who has had Secret Service protection since 2015, was taken away in a motorcade. He held up a fist as he got into his SUV. A senior government official confirmed to CBS News that the former president is safe. President Biden has received an initial briefing on the incident. Lauren Linder, CBS News, Butler, Pennsylvania.
And CBS News has learned in recent moments that former President Donald Trump was released from the hospital. Now, President Joe Biden did make an initial statement regarding that incident earlier this evening. Despite the ongoing political discourse between the two presidential candidates, President Biden condemned the incident, calling it, quote, sick, and says there is no place for this kind of violence in the U.S.
But the bottom line is that the Trump rally was a rally that he should have been able to can be conducted peacefully without any problem. But the idea that there's political violence or violence in America like this is just unheard of. It's just not appropriate. And everybody must condemn it.
Our Kentucky lawmakers also posting their reactions on social media and sharing their messages online tonight. Democratic Governor Andy Beshear says he and First Lady Brittany Beshear are praying for the safety and health of the former president. He goes on to say that violence is never the answer, never. WKYT's Jessica Umbro joining us now in studio with what the Commonwealth's Republican political leaders have to say about the incident. Jessica?
Well, politicians, regardless of party, have been commenting throughout the evening, including Kentucky's top political leaders. U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell writing in part, quote, "Tonight, all Americans are grateful that President Trump appears to be fine after a despicable attack on a peaceful rally. Violence has no place in our politics." And Kentucky's other U.S. Senator Rand Paul reposted a video that shows the moments just after those shots rang out. And he wrote, quote, "Please keep Trump and everyone at the rally in your thoughts and prayers right now." All 6 of Kentucky's U.S. representatives have also commented. Representative Andy Barr posted, "Please join me in praying for President Trump." Representative Hal Rogers wrote in part, "Please join me in praying for @real Donald Trump and all who were impacted by the cowardly attack at the rally in Pennsylvania." And Kentucky's only Democrat representative, Morgan McGarvey, posted in part, quote, "What happened at the Trump rally today is horrible and unacceptable." He continued, "America is a democracy. Political violence is never acceptable." Now, this is not an exhaustive list. We'll keep updating on any additional posts made throughout this evening.